Hi folks, Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and today I am doing yet another installment of the freelancer Q&A that I do regularly. I can also see myself in I need a haircut, so uh, that's cool. Anyway, I guess I must not look in a mirror all that often, that it's just like I have to look in a little screen grab here. I'm getting really off the rails here, and I apologize for that. Today's question is, what should client onboarding look like? And as best I can recall, I think this was asked of me in response to some kind of offhand mention of the idea of onboarding, and then somebody was like, what do you mean onboarding? So I'm going to go through that here today and talk about the idea of onboarding clients for you as a service provider, as a services practice, so freelancers or services businesses in general. So I guess first, let me explain a little bit about what I mean by onboarding, just like in concept. And what I'm getting at is that whenever you have clients, there are going to be certain, I guess, repeatable processes, or at least pieces of information that you obtain from those clients. So when you engage with somebody, once you've started to do that more than a handful of times, there are going to be patterns in how that engagement tends to go. And onboarding is essentially you doing a series of things up front at the beginning of an engagement that are going to be typical of your engagements. So it's, I guess you could think of it, a loose analog, if you've been in the employment world, is like when you onboard as an employee. So your employer onboards you and they give you a handbook and a tour of the office or whatever happens. So that's onboarding in the employer-employee sense. Now, you as a service provider, there are going to be certain things, just like employer-employee, there are going to be certain commonalities to being a client of yours, at least once you're a little bit sophisticated with it. So that's the general idea. And if that sounds foreign to you, let the idea marinate a little bit, because it's going to make the client experience that you have a lot more buttoned up. It'll make you seem a good bit more professional if you have actual client onboarding. One thing I'll mention philosophically here is, I guess, it seems like everybody I've ever had a conversation with about this concept, it hasn't required a lot of sales. That everybody, once they kind of grok it, in my experience, is sort of like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, I should do that. I haven't ever had anybody that I can recall come back and say, what do you mean that's stupid? It should be a different thing every time. But let me say this, I guess, in defense of the concept for anybody that might be watching. When you're going through any kind of sales process, whatever that might look like, in sales and then the early going of engaging with clients, one of the two of you is going to establish the structure of what your engagement looks like. And if it isn't you, it's going to be the client. And what I'm getting at is, if the only way you've ever won business, for instance, is like Upwork, and you were to say like, okay, you're answering like bids or whatever happens on Upwork. So they're putting out some work. The client is like, all right, I want you to like, do staff augmentation for me or whatever. If you go through the process and they say, we're going to interview 20 freelancers and pick the best one, they're determining the structure. So they're dictating how your sales process is going to go. And if they're doing it like that, they're also probably going to dictate how the engagement is going to go and what terms and contracts you're going to sign. The more that you start to take control of your sales process and your onboarding process and contracts and all that, the more that you're doing that, the less the client is going to do that. And it's really going to kind of even the balance of power between you, and it's going to give you a lot more control and autonomy and negotiation of everything. So that is kind of my pitch for the idea of onboarding, is it starts to make you more of an equal and less of kind of a supplicant for business. You start to look less like a pseudo employee. And actually, that kind of segues nicely into a note I made here, which is to talk about who this is and isn't going to be applicable to. So if you're a freelancer, it's fair to say that you could put together a little bit of an onboarding checklist or have some onboarding in mind. That's entirely reasonable for a freelancer to do, and for you to make it like more sophisticated as you go. Now, it won't apply as much in two main situations that I can think of. One is if you're in a heavily commodified space, like I was just talking about, like let's say that you're on Upwork and somebody has put out like a call for work or whatever, RFP, something like that. The more commodified the application is, the less applicable your onboarding is. And this could even apply to like agencies. But if somebody puts out an RFP, a request for proposals, and says, okay, I want an agency to come and build me a website, and everybody who wants to apply for this business, agency, freelancer, whatever, needs to do the following things: put together a presentation of this length, write up a proposal covering this, blah, blah, blah. They're dictating the rules of engagement here. So your onboarding is going to be less and less relevant if they're dictating the process. And that will apply, number one, if you're a pseudo employee. So if you're used to getting work by like, as a freelancer, doing things like going through interviews or submitting work samples or all this kind of stuff. If you're used to the process looking a lot like it would if you were an employee, your onboarding isn't going to be super relevant. Another situation is if you're doing subcontract work and it's a well-established structure. So Hit Subscribe would actually be a good example of this if you're doing like contract work, writing, editorial, etc. There's a well-established process, and we have a lot of folks doing work in that process. So if you were to want to write for Hit Subscribe, and we've had hundreds of authors over the years, if you came in and said, well, unlike all the other authors, this is, I want to onboard with you, and here's how I do things, it just hits, well, I don't actually know what Angela would do. I'm a little far removed from that now, but my guess is that wouldn't go the way you wanted it to, because we would just say, no, this is how we work. It's kind of a well-established thing. Nothing against you, go out and freelance write or freelance edit or whatever you want to do on your terms, but we just have a playbook here. So those are two situations where I wouldn't really bother with trying to establish an onboarding process, but in any other situation, I would. And, kind of here's why I would. Here's the purpose of doing that. One, you're establishing the rules of engagement, and this is important for you, especially as you get traction in the freelance world. You ought to cover this during your sales process, but onboarding is essentially the bridge between sales and engagement. So if you haven't covered this in sales process, discovery and disqualification, you should at least cover it in onboarding, which is, what are your invoice terms, things of that nature. So you're establishing the rules for interacting between you and your clients. It also has kind of the purpose of maybe impressing the client, but at the very least, giving them a good client experience. So you're looking to onboard the client and establish with them kind of, here's what you can expect. I'm going to communicate in the following ways. I have, these sheets that you can refer to, etc. So part of it is, establishing like rules, if you will, but just taking care of, stuff that you need to set down to make clear to them in order to have a successful engagement. And then also part of it is making them reassured and even impressing them with your professionalism, in the sense of like, I've done this before. I've done it so many times. In fact, I have a checklist of things that I go through whenever I onboard clients. This is something I've said in the past, but you might think, if you've never done something like this before, if you've never been the one supplying the structure, this might seem very bold, especially if you're used to employment, where it's always the employer that is setting the structure. I'm going to interview, I'm going to ask these questions, blah, 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 blah. It might seem strange to kind of invert that and say, okay, I'm the professional here, here's how onboarding goes with me, here's how I work, etc. It generally isn't. If you do that, if that's kind of your energy in the process from the beginning, it will generally set the client more at ease than anything else, because if what you do is build websites all day, every day, or if what you do is come in and remediate tech debt all day, every day, it's reassuring to them for you to say, hey, I've done this 50 times before, here's how it's going to go, you supply me this, I do this, etc. So it will generally not, if you know what you're doing and you actually have the reps behind you, it won't seem presumptuous. it will seem reassuring. And you can imagine what this looks like. So like, let's say that you are, air conditioning breaks or something, and you call various professionals out, what would reassure you more? The one that comes in and says, okay, I'm going to take a look at your air conditioning. I need you to do A, B, C, and D. When you do that, I'm going to do these things, and then I'm going to give you a quote, if they were confident, or if they came in and said, I have 10 years of air conditioning. Do you want to ask me some questions? Like, you wouldn't hire that person. You would want the confident person that says, yep, I deal with broken air conditioners all day, every day. Here's what needs to happen. So hopefully, that sets your mind at ease about this, that establishing an onboarding process is in fact a good idea. It will generally play well with the clients. So let me scroll down in here in my notes a little bit. I'm kind of far removed from actually doing this. It's Aaron for Hit Subscribe that does this these days. I don't actually even remember every detail of what so for Hit Subscribe, there is kind of two onboarding. We do a kickoff call, but then there is also like an asynchronous onboarding checklist that happens and that the account managers administer. So I am a little bit far removed from defining a process like this, but I'm going to try to think back and also think back how I used to do this in my consulting days and go through a checklist. So first and foremost, one of the things that I would make sure to cover during onboarding would be how you work. The way I would probably do this is to have kind of a cheat sheet or write up like bullets and distribute that to them is a good way to do that. So what I'm talking about with how you work, I would think through something like, how do you communicate? Do you answer email? Are you going to give the client your phone number? Don't give the client your phone number. Don't do that. Please don't do that. So, that kind of thing. All right, so here's how I communicate. I do email. I am not going to join your Slack, but I will be responsive to email. You'll hear back from me during work hours within 2 hours, So how you work is going to include things like your preferred mode of communication, your, what would you call it? Responsiveness agreement. Why can't I think of it? Like a SLC, service lifecycle agreement. So how quickly they can expect you to respond. That's a good thing to establish to prevent them from being like demanding like constant async attention. Like, I will always get back to you within 1 business day. So things of that nature. And I would brainstorm. If you haven't done this exercise before, look at your last few engagements. How did they go? How do you want them to go? Perfectly fair to use this as double duty to promise responsiveness, but establish boundaries. Speaking of which, what times of day are you responsive? Are you going to respond on weekends? That type of thing. So you can start to brainstorm all of this stuff and then write it up. And I wouldn't go overboard with it, and I wouldn't really bake it into a contract. I mean, I guess you could, but your contract to a client is just going to be sort of window dressing anyway. I would have a little like PDF or something that I distribute about how you work. I communicate in these media, these hours. You can expect this kind of responsiveness time from me. I will provide reports on the progress of the engagement every week or every 2 weeks. So establish a series of things about how you work and write them up, and I would distribute that to clients. You could probably tell them about it during your sales process, but during onboarding, I would give them a cheat sheet of it. And you could, even if you were so inclined and getting more sophisticated, have a I don't know, like a portal would be strong, but maybe like a Google Drive or something that you set up, and maybe there's a document like how I work. And then as you go along, there might be other forms of collateral that you want to put in there. But give them an easy to access and easy to remember source of truth about the engagement is something that I would recommend doing during onboarding. So you're going to want that bit of collateral. What else during onboarding? In as much as you're going to exchange paper like contracts, I'm not a big fan of contracts, but something that we do with Hit Subscribe and something that wouldn't be the worst idea is to draw up a very simple client service agreement or something of that nature. Not so much because especially if you're doing app dev and you're doing it with like mid-market and up companies, they're probably going to get you to sign some variant of their contract or services agreement, and you'll probably mark that up if you do anything. But having a contract of some sort in your back pocket is a good look. So you could do that as part of your onboarding. I would also recommend scheduling a kickoff call, especially if you're doing high ticket or longer term services. So I wouldn't like read your list of how I work during that call or anything like that. The kickoff call I would use as an opportunity. I would definitely set an agenda for it that you distribute to them in advance. This should come off as something between a collaborative call and a deck that you run through. And what you should be doing on that initial call with an agenda that's very well preset is setting up the engagement for success. So if I'm thinking about like a website build, you might be getting information from them about like the design that they want to see. You might be working with them through variables that would factor in so that you can come out of that meeting having set out some tentative milestones, something like that. So anything that is kind of like, here's how I work, any questions like that goes into a document. Anything that is going to be collaborative or better off in a presentation in nature, I would do on an initial kickoff call. But keep that, you don't want that to be like a rambling affair. If you're going to have that kickoff call, you definitely want an agenda that you go through. Another part of onboarding that I would recommend having is to ask the client what their preferences are. So in situations where, you know, say you don't have a real preference between email and Slack or something, either one of those is good for you, then maybe you can gather up some stuff like them, and either with some kind of Google form or, you know, in theory on the call, you could discuss with them like, okay, I have some questions for you. You know, do you prefer email or Slack? Do you prefer Word documents or PDF deliver, you know, that type of thing. So that can be a good look as well, especially if there are different ways that you can do things. One thing that we've started doing with Hit Subscribe in the last year that you might find interesting as food for thought is to ask clients, like, if we're collaborating, and if you're doing like time and materials or something, this might be less relevant, but if we're collaborating and something slogs down in your code, if we've given you some deliverables and then it's on you to, you know, review them or publish them or whatever, do you prefer that we be sort of aggressive in following up with you? Or if we've followed up once and sent you an email, no, I got this, I'm on top of my inbox, you'll hear from me when I'm ready. So little things like that, like what are your communication preferences? Do you want me to be like an over communicator? Not so much. Do you want me to be passive? You can ask about things like that and then note them down for how to conduct the engagement. So I guess if I think about that, there's kind of like, I would say 3 potential components to the onboarding. One, here's kind of a cheat sheet of non-negotiables. This is how I work. It's here for your reference. And I don't mean that in the bargaining sense. It's just, you know, this is how I communicate. This is when I'm available and so on. So that you can kind of give to them and establish as a source of truth. And if it starts to get a little more involved, you can have an actual like drive or portal or something that they can refer to. The next component or another component would be kickoff, where you're establishing milestones and collaborating with them to sketch out how the engagement is going to go and map out success, and maybe like check-in points, etc. And then finally, there would be the piece of the onboarding where you're taking input from them on their preferences, where you could go either way and you just want to know the best thing to make them happy. And I would think probably, especially for a freelancer, those 3 components are enough. It's certainly enough to give you food for thought in how you might conduct a client onboarding process. I'll close out with a suggestion, though. For the most part, I would recommend starting informally and without too much in the way of onboarding, and that everything you do along the lines of what I've mentioned, base it in past engagements, because what you really don't want to do is come off as sort of a blowhard, or like you're pretending. Like, you know, people will see this a mile away if it's your very first engagement and you're like, every time I onboard, I, you know, do this, and my payment terms are right now, and all my clients do. Like, anybody will see right through that immediately and be like, oh, you've never done this before, and I can see that. So it really helps if you base your onboarding process either in past experience or just like simple pragmatic agreement. So you don't have to have ever done business before to say, here is how I prefer to communicate. I'm, available at these hours and I communicate over email. But keep it authentic and ideally keep it rooted in past experience, because that will be something that clients pick up on if you're pretending in a lot of experience that you don't have. So I hope this is somewhat informative for you. If you don't have an onboarding process, I strongly recommend you at least start to think about one, and then on your next engagement, implement something, even if it's fairly straightforward and simple, and just kind of iterate on it, retrospect when you're done, and keep adding to it, and even taking away from it, but refining it as makes sense. So hopefully that is helpful, and I will catch you all next time.